Maintaining Transatlantic Community, U.S. Public Diplomacy, the Ford Foundation and the Successor Generation Concept in U.S. Foreign Affairs, 1960 to 1980s. Written by Giles Scott Smith and published in 2014 in the journal Global Society, Volume 28, Number 1, pages 90 to 103. Abstract. This article explores the role of public-private partnerships in promoting transatlantic unity during the Cold War. Focusing predominantly on the combined activities of American state and private initiatives, it tracks in particular the meaning of the concept of successor generations and what this meant in practice in U.S. public diplomacy. A key role was played in these activities by philanthropic organizations such as the Ford Foundation, which used its sizable funds to support initiatives such as the Atlantic Institute over several decades. The successor generation approach reached its high point during the 1980s as part of the public diplomacy offensive in support of the proposed modernization of NATO's Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, INF. During the Cold War, the common enemy of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact provided the perfect threat against which to maintain Western unity of purpose. The argument that the U.S.-Western European relationship represented a security community, a group that has achieved a level of institutional integration and holds a common belief in resolving differences peacefully, has some merit as a bottom-line identification, but it does not address the significant adaptations that occurred along the way. Point 1. This was obviously not a static arrangement, and social and political change in both East and West caused major re-evaluations. Interests could still diverge, and the belief system represented by the Atlantic Alliance still needed to be embedded and maintained in transatlantic political culture. This awareness lay behind the efforts of many in the public and private realms to ensure that NATO was seen as the central cornerstone of a wider and deeper social, cultural and economic Atlantic community. Point 2. This was no easy task. By the 1960s, both Gaullism and Ostpolitik were searching out possibilities for alternative security systems to overcome Cold War divisions, challenging U.S. leadership and threatening a fragmentation of the Western Alliance. In the 1980s, the determination to revive U.S. dominance under President Reagan once again returned to the Soviet threat as the main basis for Western unity, reviving intra-alliance concerns in the process. This article examines the concept of the successor generation in transatlantic relations and its importance as a motif for U.S.-European unity from the 1960s to the 1980s. The concept referred to the recognition that from the 1960s onwards, new generations would be entering positions of power and influence with no personal experience of binding issues such as World War II or the Marshall Plan. Such a concept also indicates an awareness that forms of political education, socialization, were required to maintain the transatlantic relationship as a form of long-term engagement. Recent studies, taking their inspiration from Manuel Castell's notion of the network society, have begun to explore the informal transnational linkages and socialization processes that lay behind the early decades of European integration. Point 3. Taking these approaches as inspiration, the successor generation concept is used here to chart an important part of the deliberate transnational network building that took place on the transatlantic level, and to make some observations on its impact. A fundamental aspect of this network building is how it was pursued over several decades by a shifting coalition of public and private institutions, with the Ford Foundation playing a paramount role. The importance of generations. The recognition of youth as a distinct social category that could influence transatlantic relations over the longer term arguably began, albeit on a small scale, with the introduction of the Rhodes Scholarships between Britain and the United States in 1902.5. Although the aftermath of World War I brought further initiatives, the Belgian-American Program of 1920, the English-speaking Union in 1926, it was only after World War II, when transatlantic relations were perceived as fundamental for U.S. national security, that attention was given on a mass scale to the future political orientation of European youth. The implementation of the Fulbright program after 1946 and the reorientation and re-education programs run during the U.S. military occupation of Germany from 1945 to 1949 are sufficient testimony to this. Point 6. The focus on generations in U.S. foreign affairs stems from this background, but is marked by a more acute understanding of political consciousness. From the 1960s onwards, the United States was viewed in Europe no longer by the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine but by Vietnam and Watergate. The U.S. had shifted from being the model to being a problem, perpetuating rather than undermining systems of repression for its own power. Likewise, an awareness of international politics was being formed not by the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance of threat but in relation to the negotiations of detente and the loosening of alliances. The successor generation idea was driven by concerns that a. the conditions for alternative political paths were increasing, and b. this could be halted, or at least delayed, if the most likely to succeed could be identified and, in that wonderful term, socialized in the norms of transatlantic cooperation. The linkage between policy approaches and social scientific research is close here. In the 1940s and 1950s, communication studies had provided the essential framework for influencing public opinion via opinion leaders in each community and society. From the 1960s onwards, sociological studies began to focus on the importance of generational difference and its impact on social stability, reckoning on divisions of around 20 years. 7 The socialization of individuals via family and educational environments, how this could be influenced, and what the political implications of this could be, were studied in depth. 8 The notion of deliberately socializing a so-called post-World War II transatlantic successor generation in the interests of U.S. security and Western cooperation as a whole was a logical extension of this. Two studies by Kenneth Adler and Stephen Szabo from the early 1980s, The High Point of Successor Generation Thinking, illustrate this approach. 9 Adler, previously an assistant professor of communication at the University of Chicago, was at the time chief of the West Europe-Canada Unit in the Office of Research of the United States Information Agency, USIA. Szabo was a professor in national security affairs at the National War College in Washington, D.C., and is now running the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Academy. In separate publications around the same time, the two authors outlined several reasons why generational change was playing an increasing role in post-war transatlantic orientation. Firstly, there was the more rapid rate of change between generations, involving a shift from traditional to modern values, gradual secularization, and increasing affluence. Secondly, there was the democratization of foreign policy deliberation, referring to a shift from elite-directed politics to elite-challenging politics. It was no longer taken for granted that elites knew the best path, particularly on security issues where the demands on the citizen in the 1950s were no longer being accepted by generations that followed. For Szabo, this also had to do with the rise in university graduates, in political literacy, and in youth-based political networks that were moving in new directions since the 1960s, the New Left, ecology, gender. Post-materialism as a broad trend was giving a higher priority to quality of life over defense and security. The two were no longer as inextricably linked as in the early Cold War. There was a tendency to see both superpowers as the problem, not one or the other as the solution. For Adler, drawing on Mannheim, Eisenstadt, and Davis 10, a generation or age cohort was defined by political components. If generational divisions were defined by experiential differences as opposed to simply family ties or age, such as with the so-called Vietnam generation, this could lead to long-term political shifts. Not surprisingly, Adler reports that the concern about the successor generation expressed by scholars and policymakers implies that they accept the thesis that the value and attitudinal differences between the younger generation and its elders will persist and will therefore affect policy. 11 The first expression of these kinds of concerns via a focus on young leaders appeared during the Kennedy administration. Just as the Peace Corps was created to mobilize American youth for the new frontier, so too did the effort begin to orientate youth worldwide towards the United States. As the State Department's Youth Task Force noted in March 1962, we seek to expand U.S. government interest in this area because we are concerned that the apparent hostility of the young people of the world to the U.S. results from our failure to convey to them an understanding of our national goals and the nature of our society. 12 With support from Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who returned from a trip through Latin America and Asia concerned about the level of disaffection towards the U.S. An Interagency Committee on Youth Affairs, IAYC, was created in April 1962 that involved the State Department, USIA, the White House, the Peace Corps, the Agency for International Development and the CIA. From then on, in what became known as the emphasis on youth, U.S. public diplomacy became focused on developing closer relations with upcoming generations of political elites in order to nurture favorable ground for the reception of U.S. foreign policy. 13 This did not mean focusing on those already supportive of U.S. aims. As the Advisory Commission on International Educational and Cultural Affairs emphasized in 1963, there should be a particular effort to seek out and select those candidates abroad who are sufficiently vigorous and restless to help promote desirable social and economic change. This may mean in some countries choosing more rising young adults, including some who are locally considered radical, left-wing, or politically dissident. 14 The private sector played an extensive and vital role in this story, in the form of funding and directing programs either in alliance with or completely autonomous from government. With NATO as the cornerstone, several groups emerged through the 1950s and early 1960s to promote the common ideals of an Atlantic community, such as the Atlantic Treaty Association, the Atlantic Council and the NATO Parliamentarians' Assembly. 15 The Atlantic Council of the United States, ACUS, was formed in 1961 exactly to consolidate the various private groups acting in support of the Atlantic Alliance in the United States. With governments wary of taking on too much of an open propaganda role for NATO, these initiatives were an ideal means to indicate the strength of transatlantic contacts within Western civil society itself. Specific programs were created to form networks of up-and-coming individuals, such as the Atlantic Treaty Association's sponsorship of the Atlantic Committee of Political Youth, which became the Atlantic Association of Young Political Leaders, AYPL, in 1963. There was also a U.S. wing, the American Council of Young Political Leaders, ACYPL. 16. The Ford Foundation and Atlantic Affairs in the 1960s. Private sources of finance were vital for these ventures to ensure at least the semblance of political independence. The major foundations such as Carnegie and Rockefeller had been sponsoring and running their own educational exchanges since the early 20th century. A special role was played by the Ford Foundation, something of a latecomer in the 1950s, which soon initiated a global program to promote social change along manageable, progressive lines. 17 By the mid-1950s the Ford Foundation was running multiple European projects via its extensive international affairs program. Ford's outlook on Atlantic affairs was, at this time, dominated by Shepard Stone, and former High Commissioner to Germany John McCloy. These two, together with close associates Jean Monnet and George Ball, supported the two-pillar concept of Atlantic Partnership that foresaw the advancement of European integration and institution building within the context of a broader Atlantic community under the benevolent leadership of the U.S. 18 In 1961, the heyday of Kennedy transatlanticism, these ideas found form in the Atlantic Institute, established in Paris as the European counterpart to the Atlantic Council. 19 For the next 25 years. The Institute sought to promote and develop a spirit of community among Atlantic peoples, the strengthening of the social institutions of the Atlantic community, the harmonization of the long-range interests of the community. 20 At the heart of the Institute's mission was the nurturing of an intellectual, policy-relevant network that took the common interests of the Atlantic region as its starting point. Ford provided an initial $250,000 grant and followed up with another $300,000 in 1962, $400,000 in 1965, and $800,000 in 1969, by far the largest amounts from a single donor institution, 42% of the total budget in 1969. Other sources were the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Scaife family, the Avalon Foundation and the Old Dominion Foundation, these last two merging in 1969 to form the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. 21 From the very beginning the Atlantic Institute sought to overcome national divisions by promoting transatlantic problem-solving. Writing to the Ford Foundation's Joseph Slater in July 1964, Institute Director General Walter Dowling argued that European socio-economic recovery had brought with it renewed confidence and a resurgence of nationalism. With Gaullism as the main threat, Dowling called for the formation of a junior Bilderberg for young leaders who now lack the incentive and the opportunity of the immediate post-war years to talk and to work together. 22 A Young Leaders program had been established early on to bring together North Americans and West Europeans, but outside of the prestigious locations, such as Bellagio in November 1966, the initiative lacked purpose. Under the direction of Joseph Harned, who later became the Institute's representative in Washington, D.C., the program was given more substance by linking the meetings directly with the Institute's ongoing research projects. Participation fulfilled several functions: professional networking on a transatlantic level, training in transatlantic problem-solving, the creation of a kind of community that the Institute could draw on for expertise in the future. 23 Harned himself saw this as producing an international back-channel network of communication and understanding. 24 With the Institute as the center, other transnational leadership initiatives were pursued. Jim Huntley, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who pioneered the Institute's creation, joined the Ford Foundation's International Affairs program in 1965 and laid out plans for a transatlantic exchange initiative. While at Harvard, Huntley had been deeply influenced by the ideas of Italian social scientist Gaetano Mosca and the need for a multinational elite who, in certain favorable circumstances, could provide the binding interests and qualities to overcome national divisions and improve cooperation. Ford had invested a minimal grant of $8,700 towards the initial Atlantic Leaders Conference in 1958, and had tracked the development of the organization and its members thereafter. In 1964 this support was revived with a $50,000 grant to fund a 2-year pilot program for young leader exchanges in the Atlantic area. 25 In late 1965 Huntley then put forward a program for development of rising young leaders, which foresaw an initial $2 million, 3-year effort channeled through the Atlantic Institute and specifically designed to equip the leaders of tomorrow to deal with the broad public policy issues of the Atlantic area. The allocation of State Department leader grants for Western Europe had fallen from 317 in 1965 to only 110 in 1966 as the Vietnam War and concerns about the future political direction of African and Latin American elites saw resources being shifted elsewhere. Huntley felt the foundation could partly fill this shortfall. It is possible to engender consciously the desirable attitudes and educational programs which bring rising young leaders into direct and repeated contact with their peers, with older leaders in other countries, and with the institutions and problems of the European Atlantic area, and to involve them meaningfully in the ongoing business of this area. 26 Huntley's ambitious plan envisaged a program that would literally monitor, if not, via foundation patronage and a network of associated institutes, actually more or less manage, the career of promising individuals over several years, guiding them in specific directions at key moments of their career. This was therefore a far more political exercise than the public diplomacy efforts of the State Department, which welcomed this initiative. 27 The Ford Foundation had always sought to coordinate its travel and study programs and similar exchanges with the State Department and U.S. foreign policy objectives in general, and this new scheme was no different. The arrival of McGeorge Bundy as Ford Foundation president in 1966 brought cuts in expenditure and a gradual shift in priorities away from the transatlantic region, although funding for the Atlantic Institute would continue. Yet at the end of the 1960s the foundation did maintain an interest in social change in general, and the rising level of youthful radicalism in particular. In May 1967, Ford Foundation representatives joined their counterparts from the State Department, USIA, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for a conference entitled European Youth and Young Leaders in Virginia. Based on study reports covering Britain, France, and West Germany, the event highlighted once more that the best way to overcome transatlantic dissonance and build constructive links was to increase opportunities for travel to the United States. These should also be available, as one participant put it, for the serious, youthful critic. 28 As the Beacon of Hope report of 1963 had already stated, a politics of inclusion was increasingly necessary to outflank the growing criticism of U.S. power among the younger generations. The Atlantic Institute also began to move in this direction. In 1969 the Young Leaders Conferences were increased to twice a year, bringing in Japanese and, from 1972, Latin American participants, with the Institute self-consciously aiming to make vigorous efforts to blend its original support base of the creators of post-war economic reconstruction and security arrangements with the younger generation. 29 A Board of Governors meeting in mid-1971 spelled this out more clearly. The Young Leaders Conferences were overweighted with academics, researchers, and journalists, since trade union participation was only around 5–6% of the total. Incorporating more young union leaders in institute affairs could be a way to mitigate protectionist tendencies that were on the rise across the Atlantic region, and leaven out potential future political opposition. Jean Ray, the Institute's Director of Studies, pointed out that the working world must shoulder more responsibility for economic problems, but as Sir Frank Roberts delicately put it, only objective labor union people would be open to such a dialogue. 30. The successor generation in the 1980s. The Kennedy-era Interagency Committee on Youth Affairs, IACY, was wound up in 1973, partly as a result of the Nixon administration's focus on the domestic student scene. Interest in youth as a category continued, most notably in the form of the Policy Analysis and Resource Allocation Study on Youth initiated by then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in the same year, but the impetus had died down. 31 The U.S. had withdrawn from Vietnam, youthful radicalism was less of an issue, and the proposal for a transatlantic partnership was battered by trade crises and disagreements over the Middle East. Yet in a few years the approach was revived once again by a U.S. public-private partnership looking to re-engage with European youth. NATO was entering a difficult phase, caught between the challenge of Soviet SS-20 missiles aimed at Western European targets and an increasing percentage of the European population rejecting NATO modernization and nuclear weapons in general. The December 1979 twin-track decision of rearmament and disarmament expressed this fully, as did the awkward political acceptance of the decision by the Netherlands and Belgium in particular. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces, INF, debate would be at the center of intra-West relations for the best part of the following decade. Transatlantic unity had once again become a strategic necessity. During the same period the European Community, EC, expanded from the original 6 to 12 member states by 1986. And the Single European Act was signed in the same year. With economic integration moving into a new phase, the EC was gradually becoming a recognizable international actor in its own right. Atlantic federalism seemed a thing of the distant past, and for many Americans it was time that the Europeans looked after their own problems. Not for nothing did the Atlantic Institute close in 1988, it had tried to move with the times. A merger with the Trilateral Commission was proposed in the mid-1970s, but its increasingly European benefactors looked to alternative channels for policy-relevant advice. The young leader concept originated in the 1960s as an attempt to nurture a transatlantic elite who would see the Atlantic area as a space held together not just by common values but also by common policy-relevant interests, with national differences providing inspiration rather than obstacles. By the 1980s, the demands of NATO unity meant that the security community idea would prevail, albeit with a dominant U.S. leadership. 32 In a review undertaken by National Security Council staff on the purpose of exchange programs in the late 1970s, emphasis was placed on their effectiveness in terms of leadership development and building broad continuing relationships, both public and private, with leadership structures in other countries. 33 The original emphasis of Atlanticism had been to overcome national interests. This approach survived, at least rhetorically, but by the late 1970s the U.S. was looking to reinforce its position at the center of the transatlantic security community, based on unilateral national interest terms. During 1978-79 a new public-private coalition was generated to put this into practice. Led by the AUKUS, it included the Atlantic Institute, the Atlantic Treaty Association and the North Atlantic Assembly, the NATO parliamentarians. This new impetus marked a shift from young leaders, in general, to generations, in particular, a noteworthy conceptual difference that, as Adler and Szabo demonstrated, indicated a renewed attempt to interpret why political change might occur and how it might be counteracted. In 1979 the AUKUS created a working group on the successor generation, which divided into two sections, one on values and one on threats. A key influence behind this venture was State Department Atlanticist Theodore Achilles, who sought to promote the views of Atlantic Federalist Clarence Streit through the AUKUS and the Atlantic Institute. 34 Subsequent reports emphasized that a lack of conviction and a disturbing uncertainty and confusion about the traditional values of Western democracy were threatening the alliance. 35 And diverging interests raised the question of whether the European-American relationship, as we have known it since 1945, will endure during the remainder of this century. 36 This tied with USIA reports from that time, which emphasized that a shared ethos could overcome policy differences between the United States and Europe, but that this was now coming into doubt, if that common frame of reference and concomitant acceptance of generally compatible goals and values were to be lost, the U.S. position in the world would indeed be precarious. 37 In these circumstances, a renewed public-private effort was required to rebuild the transatlantic relationship for the long term. In the Reagan administration the IACY was revived with an interagency working group on public diplomacy in 1982, which sought programs for gaining greater understanding among the successor generation in Europe, including not only USG programs but also pressing private groups, e.g. Atlantic associations, and other governments to put priority on such groups. 38 Efforts were also made to reach out to serious critics on the left with whom dialogue could be conducted, but the emphasis was on strengthening the voice of the pro-US moral majority throughout politics, the media, and academia. In the early 1980s, the Ford Foundation returned to the field of building transatlantic consensus, this time via the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica. In 1978, RAND received a grant from Ford for research and training projects in international security and arms control. For 2 decades following its founding in 1948, RAND was the primary think tank for analyzing the impact of new technologies on U.S. military doctrine and national security policy. Since the early 1970s, Ford Foundation money was particularly valuable for RAND to move beyond the strict confines of government contractual work and explore larger themes with more freedom of expression. A Ford assessment noted that in 1982 RAND worked on 130 national security projects funded at $28 million, about 98–99% of which was funded by government agencies. While this may have limited RAND's critical stance on government policies, it also provided almost unlimited access to policymakers and the real possibility that the results of its research would have an impact. 39 In this context, it is worth looking closely at what RAND did with the 1978 grant, worth $600,000 over 5 years. As is to be expected, it produced a string of publications on security matters such as Soviet policy towards detent, U.S. strategic nuclear planning, and Soviet energy security. It was also used to sponsor 4 conferences, 2 on Soviet policy, 1 on NATO planning, and 1, in February 1983, entitled The Successor Generation and the Atlantic Alliance, What Does the Future Hold? This was the responsibility of Alan Platt, a political scientist and former State Department official who joined RAND in 1982. Platt's inspiration for the conference came from a tour of Western Europe with other Republicans following the election of President Reagan in November 1980. During which the group heard from several U.S. ambassadors of problems in generating support for INF, particularly among European youth. 40 Of interest is Platt's own academic background, since his PhD had been on the opening to the left by the Kennedy administration to establish constructive contact with the Italian socialists in the early 1960s. 41 The topic of the RAND conference was of enough importance for it to gather an impressive list of sponsors. Alongside Ford were the State Department, USIA, and the NATO Information Service. With assistance from U.S. embassies in the NATO region, 51 participants from 16 countries were selected. The description of this group is worth quoting. The participants were predominantly of the successor generation, that is, under 40 years of age. They were not necessarily typical representatives of their respective societies, for they were drawn from the leadership of different elite organizations: government, academia, business, labor, political parties and movements, and the media. However, this elite, influential minority is of some consequence. A number of participants already occupy positions of significant influence in their respective countries, and many are likely to be increasingly influential as their collective generation succeeds to positions of control of their nation's foreign and defense policies in the course of the rest of this century and into the next. Therefore, the views of this group as compared with those of all members of the successor generation are of particular significance. 42 It is important to emphasize that the selection of participants deliberately aimed for a diversity of political viewpoints, ranging from Dan Smith of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, the only UK representative to attend, to Bruce Weinrod of the Heritage Foundation's Foreign Policy and Defence Studies Programme, and formerly head of the ASIPL. While the participants were meant to represent the future, most of the discussion focused on the immediate problems facing the Western Alliance, such as burden sharing and the impact of the peace movement. To this gathering, Stephen Sabo contributed an analysis of the successor generation. While major differences existed between nations, West Germany demonstrated the strongest generation gap, as opposed to Britain that seemed not to have one at all. In general, Europeans tend to be more neutralist vis-a-vis the superpowers than were the pre-war university-educated groups, more opposed to increases in defense spending, and in general have less belief that force can be used as an instrument of foreign policy. 43 Overall, the successor generation is less awed by American power and more skeptical of American leadership. The burden of proof in their eyes will increasingly come to rest upon the United States. 44 Meanwhile, in the United States itself, while support for NATO remained strong, a rising parochialism was making itself felt. The combined effects meant that there are fewer mediators or interpreters in both continents who can explain the views of each side to the other and to their own publics. Parochialism can easily lead to indifference and antagonism based upon insensitivity and misunderstanding. 45 In these circumstances, future policy directions were highly uncertain. For Szabo, these long-term changes required long-term solutions, number one being found in reinvesting in public diplomacy activities to increase contacts and change images during formative years. Direct experience should supplement the indirect sources of information which shape European stereotypes of America and Americans and vice versa. 46 Fostering cultural mediators was after all one of the principal goals of a well-orchestrated public diplomacy strategy. According to Alan Platt, the RAND Conference itself was a way of nurturing a positively minded successor generation into existence. Although RAND did obtain follow-up grants from the Ford Foundation in 1983 and 1987 to extend its research on U.S. relations with friends and adversaries in the 1980s and 1990s, it did not return to the successor generation theme. 47 However, an added element also sponsored by Ford was improving the level of cooperation between RAND and similar security-orientated think tanks in Western Europe. The most productive relations were developed with the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. Not coincidentally, in the frontline INF state of West Germany, which led to an exchange of researchers and conference and publication projects. Other platforms for cooperation were established with the Institut Français des Relations Internationales in Paris and Chatham House in London. The possible policy benefits of bringing the major security think tanks into alignment on transatlantic and East-West security issues were obvious. At the same time, Platt did pursue the successor generation theme separate from RAND, embarking on a series of 10 USIA-sponsored trips between 1983 and 1985 as a touring lecturer on U.S. foreign policy throughout Western Europe. However, plans to expand the RAND Conference report into a book, including supplementary material he collected on these trips, never materialized. 48 U.S. diplomats across Western Europe applied the successor generation approach with some zeal. With West Germany a frontline state in the INF debate, U.S. Ambassador Arthur Burns turned his attention specifically to becoming a communicator of American ideas, ideals, and policies to the country's youth. As his public affairs officer, POW, Hans Tuch remarked later, the so-called successor generation became his particular target. 49 In France, Terence Catherman, Director of European Affairs at USIA and a member of the Atlantic Council's Working Group, became the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Paris during 1983-86, giving him direct responsibility for the running of educational exchange. The U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands during 1984-86, L. Paul Bremer, has stated that there was clearly a successor generation issue in the way exchanges were applied to expand first-hand U.S.-European contacts and build emotional ties within the alliance. 50 Robert Hopper, political officer in London from 1982-86, has remarked that we were very busy with the successor thing. 51 How these attitudes were translated into practice can be seen in an overview of those who toured the United States on the International Visitor Program, the State Department's invitation-only exchange program for up-and-coming talents. The program's list for these years does reveal some significant names: Gordon Brown, 1984, and Tony Blair, 1986, of Britain, Jan-Peter Balkenende, 1985, of the Netherlands, Gerhard Schroeder, 1984, of Germany, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, 1982, of Denmark, Tarja Halonen, 1983, of Finland, Alfred Gassenbauer, 1987, of Austria, and François Fillon, 1984, and Nicolas Sarkozy, 1985, of France. 52 The Brown and Blair trips were part of a long-running effort to build bridges with the moderate left of the Labour Party in Britain during a period when it radicalised to the point of accepting unilateral nuclear disarmament in its 1983 election manifesto. A string of political officers at the U.S. Embassy in London worked towards setting up links between young open-minded Labourites and the Democratic Party in the U.S., a move which probably found its most extreme expression in the visit of Peter Mandelson in 1988. Mandelson became Director of Communications for the party in 1985, and his trip consisted of a comprehensive tour from the Democratic National Committee down to local organizers involved in the upcoming presidential campaign of George Dukakis, along with a full range of media and public relations advisors. The aim was to modernize labor's approach to campaigning and open it up to American-style ideas, and Mandelson's trip exemplified this goal. While the embassy's efforts were in no way decisive in this development, they certainly contributed important extra elements to a trend that would continue through the 1990s up to Blair's election as Prime Minister in 1997.53. Conclusion. The Young Leader programs of the 1960s and the successor generation concept of the 1970s and 1980s represented efforts to manage social change by socializing upcoming talents in ways of thinking and decision-making that took a close transatlantic relationship for granted. This had as much an international as a domestic focus, as U.S. liberal internationalists, and their European counterparts, expressed concerns about the direction of public opinion. These efforts were as much involved with political education as public diplomacy. Much of this focused not on economic facts or political argument but on highlighting how democratic values and social freedoms bound the Atlantic Alliance nations together. In this respect, it is important to note that a unanimity of opinion was not the goal. A respect for alternative opinion was naturally part of the democratic process. Neither is it particularly credible to think of the two coalitions covered in the 1960s, liberal internationalism, and the 1980s, national security, as policy networks. The Ford Foundation, the Atlantic Institute and the ACUS were all run by elites who mixed with the policy-making establishment, and who themselves moved between the public and private sectors with regularity, but that does not mean that their output should be judged in terms of policy impact. There was more at stake here. As Joseph Harned has argued, the building of long-term informal relationships between individuals who would rise in the apparatus of transatlantic governance was a more important goal. 54 The Ford Foundation played a central role in this effort, most importantly through its transatlantic agenda of the early 1960s, and then again in its support for RAND's security program in the 1980s. The two periods are marked by both similarities and distinct characteristics. Both public-private coalitions regarded the transatlantic region as a core space in the context of U.S. security interests, and believed that the circulation of individuals and knowledge in that space with the U.S. at its center would reap long-term benefits. However, in the 1960s the dominant liberal internationalism possessed a firmer belief in utilizing the transatlantic region as the center for global public policy planning and institutional governance. Although the public-private coalition that promoted this cause was divided between those who prioritized European integration, those who wanted to build a new apparatus for transatlantic governance and those who wanted continuing U.S. dominance, it did hold together around the belief in benign U.S. leadership. In the 1980s, in contrast, the decline of the original Atlantic ideal meant that there was little in the way of planning, with the emphasis instead lying on reviving U.S. primacy in response to the perception that the Soviet Union had gained parity in the detent years. Whereas in the 1960s the Atlantic Institute can be seen as the flagship for transatlantic, federalist, integration, by the 1970s it was in decline and its leading role had been taken by the more US-orientated Atlantic Council. In contrast, the ACUS represented a more limited, chauvinist approach, with its project funding coming from major corporations and defense contractors, and the right-wing philanthropy of Mellon Scaife. 55 The effort to build a transatlantic youth movement based on common values and security interests continues, and indeed has been given extra impetus by the incorporation of Eastern European members into NATO during the 1990s. The formation of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association in 1996 is a good example of this. 56 Yet it is fair to say that the impetus for the successor generation effort has gone. We should be on the cusp of a new wave of Atlanticists being nurtured by public diplomacy, but we are not. Mutual interests remain. Just take a look at the German-based www.atlanticcommunity.org, but U.S. public diplomacy and U.S. security interests have moved elsewhere, to South Asia, the Persian Gulf, Africa, and East Asia. The concept of transformational diplomacy, introduced by then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2006, applies much of the successor generation approach, but Europe is not included. The Fulbright program has been undermined in Western Europe due to consistently declining U.S. financial support. The focus on the successor generation in the 1980s probably represents the last high point for efforts to manage opinion on the transatlantic relationship.